Somewhere in the western Atlantic Ocean, between the coast of Florida, the island of Bermuda, and the archipelago of Puerto Rico, there is a stretch of water that has absorbed more human imagination than almost any other place on Earth. It has no official boundaries. No government has ever drawn a line around it. No maritime authority recognizes it as a special zone. It does not appear on nautical charts with any marking that distinguishes it from the thousands of miles of ocean surrounding it. And yet for nearly a century, the name alone has carried a weight that few geographical terms can match. The Bermuda Triangle. The name was coined in 1964 by a writer named Vincent Gaddis, in a magazine article that wove together disappearances, anomalies, and unexplained losses into a single, memorable shape. But the stories that fed into that article were older, stretching back through decades of maritime records, naval logs, newspaper dispatches, and the slow accumulation of loss that the sea has always demanded. What is remarkable about the Bermuda Triangle is not what is mysterious about it. It is what happens when you remove the mystery and look at what remains. What you find are real ships, real aircraft, real storms and real currents and real human decisions made under pressure, in the dark, far from land. What you find is the Atlantic Ocean, one of the most heavily trafficked, meteorologically complex, and historically significant bodies of water in the world, doing what the Atlantic Ocean has always done. And somehow, that is more haunting than any legend. The stories gathered here are not stories of the supernatural. They are something older and quieter than that. They are stories of navigation and courage and catastrophic miscalculation. They are stories of the sea's indifference to human plans. They are stories of how myth is made, how a name, applied to a place, can transform the ordinary into the inexplicable, and how the inexplicable becomes, in time, a kind of comfort. Because there is comfort in mystery. There is something soothing about the idea that the world contains zones of genuine unknowing, places where the rules bend and the maps fail. The Bermuda Triangle offered that comfort to the 20th century. It still does, for many. But the real history of this patch of ocean is no less strange for being explainable. Every ship that vanished left records. Every crew that failed to return was mourned by someone. Every loss was investigated, documented, filed, and in many cases, eventually solved. What follows is that history. The real one. Quieter than the legend. Stranger in its own way. Get comfortable. Let's begin. The triangular shape so firmly associated with this region of ocean was not derived from any natural feature, boundary, or cartographic tradition. It was invented. In 1964, a writer named Vincent Gaddis published an article in Argosy magazine titled The Deadly Bermuda Triangle, in which he drew an imaginary triangle connecting 3 points, Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, and proposed that the losses within this zone were too numerous to be accidental. The shape was rhetorically useful, visually memorable, and entirely arbitrary. Gaddis was not a navigator or a maritime historian. He was a writer who understood that a named shape carries more power than a vague region. The triangle he drew has since been reproduced millions of times. It appears on maps, in textbooks, in films and documentaries. But it was never anything more than a literary device. The ocean does not know where its corners are. The stretch of water now called the Bermuda Triangle is not, by any statistical measure, more dangerous than comparable regions of ocean. Lloyd's of London, the oldest and most authoritative maritime insurance market in the world, does not charge higher premiums for vessels passing through this area. Their actuarial records, compiled over centuries of maritime loss data, show no anomalous concentration of incidents within the triangle's boundaries. The United States Coast Guard, which maintains meticulous records of maritime accidents in American waters, has stated formally and repeatedly that the number of disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle is not disproportionate to the volume of traffic that passes through it. When the statistics are examined without the frame of the legend, the triangle disappears. What remains is simply the Atlantic. The earliest disappearance most frequently cited in connection with the Bermuda Triangle occurred not in the 20th century but in 1800, when the USS Pickering, a naval schooner, vanished somewhere in the Atlantic while sailing from Guadeloupe to Delaware. She carried 90 men and was never seen again. No wreckage was found. No survivors emerged. The loss was attributed at the time to a severe Atlantic storm that struck the region during the same week. The Pickering was not a mystery in 1800. She was a tragedy. It was only later, filtered through the lens of the triangle legend, that her disappearance acquired a strange retroactive quality, as if the ocean had been collecting victims long before anyone thought to give it a name. Christopher Columbus, sailing through what would later be designated the Bermuda Triangle on his first voyage to the Americas in 1492, recorded several anomalies in his log. On the night of September 15, he and his crew observed a strange light moving in the sky, described as a glowing object that appeared to rise and then fall toward the horizon. On October 8, his compass began behaving erratically, deviating several degrees from magnetic north. Both of these observations have since been explained. The light was almost certainly a meteor, and the compass deviation was the result of Columbus crossing an agonic line, a zone where magnetic north and true north briefly align, causing compass needles to shift. Columbus did not believe he was in a cursed sea. He noted the anomalies with the careful attention of a skilled navigator and sailed on. The Bermuda Triangle sits over one of the deepest sections of the Atlantic Ocean. The Puerto Rico Trench, located at the triangle's southeastern boundary, descends to a maximum depth of approximately 8,376 meters, making it the deepest point in the entire Atlantic Ocean. At such depths, any vessel or aircraft that sinks has an extraordinarily slim chance of ever being recovered. The water pressure at the floor of the trench is roughly 820 times the pressure at the surface. Metal compresses. Wood disintegrates. Even the most robust black box flight recorders have physical depth limits. The absence of wreckage in many Bermuda Triangle disappearances is frequently presented as evidence of something supernatural. In many cases, it is simply evidence of how deep the ocean is. The Gulf Stream, one of the most powerful ocean currents on Earth, flows directly through the Bermuda Triangle. Moving northward along the eastern coast of the United States before sweeping across the Atlantic toward Europe, the Gulf Stream moves at speeds of up to 2.5 meters per second, carrying roughly 30 million cubic meters of water per second past the tip of Florida. For surface debris from a sunken vessel, this current acts like a conveyor belt, dispersing wreckage across hundreds of miles within days. Ships that sink in the Gulf Stream do not necessarily leave evidence where they went down. The current carries what the sea does not swallow. This hydrological reality explains the absence of wreckage in numerous well-documented disappearances without requiring any supernatural explanation. The Bermuda Triangle sits in a region of the Atlantic particularly susceptible to waterspouts, rotating columns of water-saturated air that form over warm ocean surfaces and can reach heights of several hundred meters. A waterspout of significant size carries enough kinetic energy to capsize a small vessel instantly and to cause serious structural damage to larger craft. They form rapidly, often within minutes, and can be nearly invisible at certain angles in certain light conditions. Historical maritime records from the Caribbean and the Western Atlantic contain numerous accounts of vessels encountering waterspouts without warning. Most survived. Some did not. The ones that did not leave behind only the absence of their arrival. On December 5, 1945, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers designated Flight 19 took off from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale in Florida for a routine training exercise. They never returned. The loss of Flight 19, 14 men and 5 aircraft, became the foundational event of the Bermuda Triangle legend, repeated in every account, reproduced in every documentary. What is less frequently mentioned is that the flight's leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, was flying with a borrowed watch, had requested not to fly that day, and made a navigational error early in the flight that he was unable to correct. Radio transmissions recorded Taylor's increasing disorientation as he guided his squadron in the wrong direction, convinced he was over the Gulf of Mexico when he was in fact east of Florida. When the aircraft ran out of fuel, they went down over open water in darkness. The loss was catastrophic. It was also, in all likelihood, navigational. The search aircraft sent to find Flight 19 also vanished. A Mariner flying boat with 13 crew members took off shortly after the Avenger's distress calls began and was never heard from again. The loss of the rescue plane deepened the mystery of that December evening considerably. However, a merchant vessel in the area reported observing a mid-air explosion shortly after the Mariner's departure, followed by a burning slick on the water. The Martin Mariner aircraft was informally known among pilots as the flying gas tank for its tendency to accumulate fuel vapors in its fuselage. An accidental ignition in a search aircraft flying through darkness over open water is a grim but plausible explanation. The explosion was witnessed. The wreckage was not recovered. The USS Cyclops was a naval collier, a coal-carrying vessel, that departed Barbados in March 1918 with 309 men on board and vanished somewhere in the Atlantic. She was the largest single loss of life in the history of the United States Navy not directly attributable to combat. No distress signal was ever received. No wreckage was ever found. No survivor ever emerged. The Cyclops had a known mechanical problem with one of her engines, was traveling through waters where German submarines were active, and was carrying a cargo of manganese or a dense material that can cause catastrophic structural failure if improperly loaded. Her captain, George Worley, was described by multiple crew members as erratic and possibly unfit for command. None of these factors, alone or together, has ever been proven to explain her loss. She remains genuinely unknown. This is not mythology. It is simply unresolved. Bermuda itself, the island at the triangle's northern point, has an extraordinary and largely forgotten history as a maritime graveyard. The islands sit atop a submerged volcanic seamount, surrounded by one of the largest coral reef systems in the North Atlantic. The reefs extend for miles in certain directions, invisible beneath the surface, and the waters around them are laced with underwater rock formations that have claimed hundreds of vessels over 4 centuries of regular Atlantic traffic. The Bermuda Maritime Museum holds records of more than 300 confirmed shipwrecks in Bermudian waters alone. Most of these sinkings have nothing to do with mystery. They are the result of navigating through some of the most hazardous reef systems in the Western Atlantic in an era before GPS, before radar, before any of the tools that make modern maritime navigation relatively safe. The legend of the Bermuda Triangle has occasionally been traced to a 1950 article by journalist Edward Van Winkle Jones, published in the Miami Herald, which catalogued a series of disappearances in the region without drawing any supernatural conclusions. Jones wrote factually, noting the concentration of incidents, and suggested that the area deserved more attention from maritime authorities. His article was republished in a condensed form by the Associated Press and reached a national audience. It planted a seed. But Jones himself never claimed anything paranormal. He was a reporter documenting a pattern. What subsequent writers did with that pattern, the extrapolations, the elaborations, the accumulation of mythology, had nothing to do with Jones's original intent or findings. One of the most cited Bermuda Triangle disappearances, the loss of the cargo ship Marine Sulphur Queen in February 1963, has a more prosaic explanation than most accounts suggest. The vessel was a converted World War II oil tanker that had been refitted to carry liquefied sulfur at temperatures above 130 degrees Celsius. Her hull was in documented poor condition, and her stability had been questioned by maritime inspectors prior to her final voyage. When she disappeared with all 39 crew members, the Coast Guard investigation found evidence of structural weakness, inadequate safety equipment, and a history of mechanical problems. Life belts from the vessel were found floating in the Straits of Florida. The inquiry concluded that the ship most likely experienced a catastrophic structural failure. The triangle was mentioned in headlines. The structural report was not. The myth of ships and aircraft being pulled into the triangle by some unknown force has a partial and ironic origin in the actual behavior of the ocean floor. The Bermuda Triangle overlaps with a region where methane hydrate deposits exist beneath the seabed. In certain geological conditions, these deposits can destabilize and release large volumes of methane gas rapidly, a phenomenon known as a methane blowout. The resulting gas eruption can, theoretically, reduce the density of the water sufficiently to cause a surface vessel to lose buoyancy and sink with extraordinary speed. The mechanism is real. Whether it has ever actually caused the sinking of a vessel in the Bermuda Triangle is unconfirmed. But the science of it is sound, and the image it conjures, a ship swallowed almost instantly by a patch of suddenly gaseous ocean, is striking enough to have lodged in public imagination. In 1975, a writer named Lawrence David Cush published a book titled The Bermuda Triangle Mystery, Solved, in which he systematically examined each of the major disappearances cited in the triangle literature and compared the popular accounts with actual historical records. What he found, repeatedly, was that the sources had been manipulated. Ships that had allegedly disappeared without a trace had in fact sunk in storms that were clearly documented in meteorological records at the time. Vessels that had disappeared in the triangle had actually gone down hundreds of miles outside its boundaries. Some ships that were listed as mysteriously lost were, in the historical record, simply lost in the ordinary maritime sense, overwhelmed by weather, navigation error, or mechanical failure, in ways consistent with countless other maritime losses of the same era. Cush's book was meticulous, footnoted, and largely ignored by the popular press. The Sargasso Sea occupies a significant portion of the Bermuda Triangle's interior. Unlike any other sea on Earth, the Sargasso Sea has no land boundaries. It is defined entirely by four surrounding ocean currents, which form a slow, clockwise gyre. Its waters are exceptionally clear, deep blue, and warm, and they are covered in vast mats of free-floating sargassum seaweed that can stretch for hundreds of miles. Early mariners feared the Sargasso Sea intensely, not because of supernatural phenomena, but because sailing ships could become becalmed within it for days or weeks, unable to find wind, slowly depleting food and water. The stillness of the Sargasso was real and dangerous in the age of sail. The seaweed that choked its surface was a physical obstacle. Its reputation for swallowing ships had nothing mystical about it. Among the most sobering aspects of the Bermuda Triangle's statistical record is how many of the disappearances occurred in small, privately owned aircraft operated by relatively inexperienced pilots. The triangle sits astride some of the busiest private aviation corridors in the world, connecting Florida, the Bahamas, Cuba, and the Caribbean islands. Light aircraft flying over open ocean face hazards that have nothing to do with the location: disorientation over featureless water, the optical illusions created by haze and cloud over the sea surface, rapid weather changes in tropical maritime environments, and the simple absence of any landmark by which to correct course. Many pilots who disappeared in the triangle were making their first overwater flight. The ocean does not distinguish between the experienced and the overconfident. The island of Bermuda was not discovered by any indigenous population. It was entirely uninhabited when the Spanish explorer Juan de Bermudez sighted it around 1503. It remained uninhabited for more than a century after that, not because it was unknown, but because it was actively avoided. Mariners called it the Isle of Devils, and the name reflected a genuine navigational fear. The reefs surrounding Bermuda were treacherous. The currents around it were unpredictable. The island was regularly lashed by storms of extraordinary violence, and the sound made by the wind passing through the cedar trees was, to early sailors, something between a warning and a lament. It was colonized permanently only in 1609, after the Sea Venture was wrecked on its reefs, stranding her passengers, who found, to their considerable surprise, that the island was habitable, fertile, and not, in fact, occupied by devils. The wreck of the Sea Venture in 1609 is one of the founding events of both Bermudian and American colonial history, and it occurred in precisely the waters now associated with the Bermuda Triangle. The Sea Venture was the flagship of the Virginia Company's resupply mission to Jamestown Colony, carrying approximately 150 passengers and crew. She was struck by a severe hurricane and driven deliberately onto a Bermuda reef by her captain, George Summers, to prevent her from sinking in deep water. All hands survived. The survivors spent 10 months on Bermuda building 2 new vessels from the Sea Venture's wreckage and from local cedar wood. The account of the wreck, written by one of the survivors, is believed to have influenced Shakespeare in the writing of The Tempest. The Bermuda Triangle's most famous antecedent story is, at its core, a story of survival. Naval Air Station Bermuda, which operated throughout the Second World War, placed Bermuda at the center of Allied anti-submarine operations in the Atlantic. The Western Atlantic was among the most contested stretches of ocean in the entire war. German U-boats hunted Allied shipping lanes with devastating effectiveness, particularly in 1942, a period known to German submariners as the Happy Time. Hundreds of Allied vessels were sunk in the waters now labeled the Bermuda Triangle during the war years. Their losses were not listed in the Triangle mythology for a simple reason: their disappearances were explained. They had been torpedoed. The distinction between explained disappearance and mysterious disappearance, as applied to the Triangle, frequently reflects nothing more than whether a contemporary investigation managed to assign a cause. The Douglas DC-3 aircraft that disappeared on December 28, 1948, while flying from Puerto Rico to Miami, became one of the most frequently cited aviation mysteries of the Triangle. The aircraft carried 32 passengers and 3 crew members. Radio contact was made with Miami when the aircraft was approximately 50 miles south of the city. It was never seen again. What is less frequently noted is that the aircraft's batteries had been reported as dead before departure, and the flight had been significantly delayed. No distress call was made. No wreckage was ever found, but the southern approaches to Miami pass over deep water and strong currents. The DC-3's final radio transmission was routine. Whatever happened, happened quickly, and in the dark, and over very deep water. The Triangle region encompasses the northeastern corner of the Caribbean Sea, one of the most historically significant maritime corridors in the world. For 3 centuries, this passage carried the accumulated wealth of the Spanish colonial empire: gold and silver from Mexico and Peru, spices and dyes from Central America, pearls from Venezuelan waters. The Spanish treasure fleet system, which operated from the 16th to the 18th century, routed its ships directly through what is now the Bermuda Triangle twice a year. The losses sustained by the flota over those centuries were enormous. Hurricanes alone destroyed multiple entire fleets. The waters of the Triangle hold the wreckage of hundreds of Spanish galleons whose loss is perfectly documented, perfectly explained, and perfectly consistent with what large wooden ships did when they met Category 4 hurricanes in an era before weather forecasting. The atmospheric and meteorological conditions in the Bermuda Triangle are among the most volatile in the North Atlantic. The region sits in the transition zone between the temperate and tropical atmospheric systems, and it is directly affected by the formation of Atlantic hurricanes, which develop in the warm waters to the east and track westward and northward through the Triangle's territory. Tropical storms can form with extraordinary speed in this region. A tropical depression can intensify to a full hurricane within 48 hours under the right conditions. Vessels caught in open water during rapid storm development have, historically, had very little time to respond. The maritime records of the Atlantic, compiled across 4 centuries, are full of ships that left port in clear weather and never arrived. The legend of the Bermuda Triangle absorbed and reinterpreted a number of real historical mysteries that occurred outside its boundaries altogether. One of these is the fate of the brigantine Mary Celeste, which was found drifting and apparently abandoned in the Atlantic in December 1872. The Mary Celeste was discovered between the Azores and the coast of Portugal, thousands of miles from the Bermuda Triangle. Her cargo was largely intact. Her lifeboat was gone. Her crew of 7, along with the captain's wife and daughter, were never found. The Mary Celeste is one of the most genuinely mysterious maritime events in recorded history, and she has nothing whatsoever to do with the Bermuda Triangle. She was incorporated into the legend anyway, because she was strange, and because strangeness accumulates. Several of the aircraft losses cited in early Bermuda Triangle literature were later found to have occurred not in the Triangle at all, but in different regions of the Atlantic, the Caribbean, or the Gulf of Mexico. The investigative work of Lawrence Couche revealed that original source material, newspaper reports, naval inquiry records, Civil Aeronautics Board accident reports frequently placed disappearances far outside the Triangle's supposed boundaries. The geographical distortion was not always deliberate. In some cases, writers working from secondary sources simply assumed that Atlantic disappearances fell within the Triangle. In others, the boundaries were quietly expanded to include cases that strengthened the pattern. The Triangle grew to fit the mystery, rather than the mystery being confined to the Triangle. The extraordinary depth and complexity of the ocean floor within the Bermuda Triangle region has been mapped in detail only relatively recently. The Puerto Rico Trench, the Blake Plateau, the Great Bahama Bank, the tongue of the ocean, these are not flat, featureless expanses. The tongue of the ocean, which cuts into the Bahama Islands, is a deep water channel that sits directly adjacent to shallow Bahamian reef systems. An aircraft or vessel that goes down in the wrong spot, just a few kilometers to one side of a reef edge rather than the other, will either rest in water shallow enough for recovery or vanish into a trench from which no wreckage will ever be retrieved. The geography of the ocean floor in this region is, by itself, sufficient to explain why some wrecks are found and others are not. In 1967, a cabin cruiser named the Witchcraft disappeared in the waters just off Miami while its owner was taking a friend to see the Christmas lights of the city. The boat was reported missing within 1 minute of a distress call. When the Coast Guard reached the location in roughly 19 minutes, the Witchcraft was gone without trace. She had a radio aboard. She had flares. She had life preservers. And she had foam flotation built into her hull that made it essentially impossible for her to sink. She has never been found. The Witchcraft is one of the genuinely inexplicable cases in the Triangle record, not because she was swallowed by supernatural forces, but because the combination of her apparent unsinkability and her complete disappearance in calm water near a major city has never been satisfactorily explained. Some mysteries are real. They are not supernatural. They are simply unresolved. The physical experience of flying over the open ocean in a small aircraft is genuinely disorienting in ways that are difficult to convey without direct experience. With no landmarks below, and with a featureless water surface stretching to every horizon, the visual cues that pilots use to maintain orientation become unreliable. In hazy conditions, the boundary between water and sky can vanish entirely, creating what pilots call a whiteout effect in which spatial orientation must come entirely from instruments. Pilots who distrust their instruments, or whose instruments are malfunctioning, or who are flying aircraft without adequate instrumentation, can lose their orientation with frightening speed. Controlled flight into terrain, the technical term for flying an otherwise functional aircraft into the ground or water, is one of the most common causes of aviation accidents worldwide. Its ocean equivalent leaves no terrain. Only depth. The torpedo bomber chosen for Flight 19's training mission, the TBM Avenger, was a robust and capable aircraft. It was designed to carry heavy torpedo loads over open ocean, and it had a good safety record in combat operations during World War II. The Avengers of Flight 19 were, by the standards of their era, well maintained and properly equipped. What they lacked, on that particular afternoon, was an adequate navigational plan. The training route took the aircraft over open water without landmarks, in conditions that were deteriorating. When Lieutenant Taylor became disoriented, there was no effective procedure for the other pilots in the flight to independently verify their position.
5 aircraft followed their leader's compass bearing into darkness and fuel exhaustion.
The loss was organizational as much as it was navigational. A significant portion of the disappearances attributed to the Bermuda Triangle occurred during the 1940s and 1950s, a period when aviation technology had advanced rapidly but safety systems had not kept pace. Aircraft electronics of the era were susceptible to moisture, vibration, and corrosion, all of which were accelerated by operations in the warm, humid, salt-laden air of the Caribbean. Navigation over open water relied on dead reckoning, calculating position from known speed, heading, and elapsed time, which accumulated error with every passing minute. A navigation error of a few degrees, maintained for 2 hours of flight, could place an aircraft dozens of miles from where its pilot believed it to be. Over open ocean, at night, with no visible horizon, those dozens of miles were sometimes the difference between survival and disappearance. The harbor of San Juan, Puerto Rico, one of the Triangle's anchor points, has been one of the busiest ports in the Caribbean for more than 5 centuries. Founded by the Spanish in 1521, San Juan was the first European settlement on the island and served as the principal military and commercial gateway to the Spanish Caribbean Empire.
Ships entering and leaving San Juan traversed the northeastern corner of the Bermuda Triangle on every voyage.
The volume of maritime traffic through these waters, across those centuries, is staggering. The proportion of vessels that have been lost, even including all the disappearances attributed to the Triangle, is consistent with ordinary maritime loss rates for a heavily trafficked and meteorologically demanding ocean corridor.
San Juan is not the gateway to a vortex. It is simply a very old and very busy port.
The Bermuda Triangle achieved its greatest cultural prominence during the 1970s, when Charles Berlitz published a book simply titled The Bermuda Triangle in 1974. Berlitz, a linguist by training and a popular writer by vocation, compiled the Triangle's most dramatic disappearances into a compelling narrative.
The book sold millions of copies worldwide and was translated into dozens of languages.
It inspired films, television documentaries, and a generation of writers who treated the Triangle as established geographic fact.
Berlitz acknowledged none of Lawrence Kuh's debunking work in his text.
He was not writing geography. He was writing mythology, and he understood his audience precisely. The Bermuda Triangle as a cultural phenomenon is largely Berlitz's creation, though the waters he wrote about were real, and the losses were real, and the ocean's indifference was entirely real. The notion that the Bermuda Triangle might be connected to the lost continent of Atlantis entered the popular literature in the early 1970s, following various interpreters of the readings of the American mystic Edgar Cayce. Cayce had prophesied in his trance readings that remnants of Atlantis would be found near the Bahamas in 1968 or 1969. In 1968, a formation of underwater limestone blocks was discovered off the coast of North Bimini in the Bahamas, since known as the Bimini Road. The formation consists of large, roughly rectangular stones arranged in a curving line on the shallow seafloor. Geological analysis has consistently dated the stones as naturally occurring limestone formations shaped by ordinary geological processes. They are, by all scientific consensus, not the remnants of a lost civilization. They are, nevertheless, striking to anyone who swims above them. The waters of the Bahamas, which form a significant portion of the Bermuda Triangle's interior, are among the most beautiful and shallowest in the western Atlantic. The Great Bahama Bank is a vast limestone plateau submerged beneath water that is, in many places, less than 10 meters deep. The intense turquoise and azure colors of Bahamian waters result from the reflection of sunlight off this pale limestone seafloor. These shallow waters are navigable only through carefully charted channels. The Columbus Passage, the Northwest Providence Channel, the tongue of the ocean each represents a corridor through an environment in which a few hundred meters of deviation from the marked route can ground a vessel irreparably.
The Bahamas are not dangerous because of what lies beneath them in a mysterious sense.
They are dangerous because they are so beautiful they look navigable where they are not. The Star Tiger, a British South American Airways Avro Tudor 4 aircraft, disappeared on January 30, 1948, while approaching Bermuda from the Azores. The aircraft carried 25 passengers and 6 crew members. Her last radio message, received when she was approximately 600 miles from Bermuda, was routine. She was never seen again. The subsequent investigation by the British Ministry of Civil Aviation found no definitive cause. However, the inquiry noted that the aircraft had been flying at a lower than recommended altitude due to headwinds and fuel concerns, that weather conditions were deteriorating, and that the Tudor 4 had a history of heating system problems that had already caused one forced landing earlier in the same journey. The Court of Inquiry concluded, in memorably careful language, that what had happened would never be known.
That admission of uncertainty is, itself, a kind of answer.
Exactly 1 year after the Star Tiger disappeared, her sister aircraft, the Star Ariel, also vanished while flying from Bermuda to Kingston, Jamaica. The Star Ariel carried 13 passengers and 7 crew members. She took off on January 17, 1949, in fine weather. Her last radio contact was made roughly 3 hours into the flight, reporting good conditions and a routine cruise at 18,000 feet. Nothing more was ever heard.
No wreckage was found.
No cause was ever determined. The loss of 2 aircraft of the same type, by the same airline, within the same approximate region of the Atlantic, within 13 months of each other, prompted the British government to ground the entire Tudor 4 fleet.
The model was ultimately withdrawn from passenger service.
The investigation found the Tudor IV's design inadequate in several respects. Whether they were lost in the Bermuda Triangle depends entirely on where you choose to draw the lines. The concept of rogue waves, single waves of extraordinary height that appear without warning in otherwise moderate sea conditions, was, for most of the 20th century, regarded as maritime folklore. Sailors reported encountering walls of water 30 meters high from seas in which 10-meter waves were the norm.
Oceanographers classified such reports as exaggeration.
Then, on New Year's Day 1995, the Dropner oil platform in the North Sea recorded a wave of 25.6 meters in seas averaging 12 meters.
The data was undeniable. Rogue waves exist. They are now understood to occur across the world's oceans under specific conditions, including conditions that occur in the Western Atlantic. A rogue wave striking a vessel already under navigational stress, in the middle of the night, far from the shipping lanes, would leave no witnesses and very little trace. The Bermuda Triangle received an unlikely contribution to its legend from the genre of science fiction.
The idea of mysterious zones in the ocean regions where normal physics was suspended, where ships could be drawn into parallel dimensions or swallowed by energy vortices, had been a staple of pulp fiction since the 1920s. When the triangle mythology crystallized in the 1960s and 1970s, it absorbed elements of this fictional tradition almost seamlessly. The language used to describe real disappearances, ships vanishing without trace, aircraft flying into clear air and never emerging, echoed the grammar of science fiction so closely that the boundary between documented loss and imaginative extrapolation became difficult to maintain. The triangle became a place where fiction felt like reporting, and reporting felt like fiction. The frequency with which the Bermuda Triangle appears in the records of the United States Navy is, in itself, historically instructive. Naval operations in the Western Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the waters around Bermuda have been continuous for the United States since the early 19th century. The Navy maintains detailed operational records, accident reports, and investigation files for every vessel and aircraft lost under its jurisdiction. The majority of naval losses in this region are documented in the Standard Inventory of Maritime and Aviation Disasters, causes assigned, cases closed. The cases that remain genuinely open, like the USS Cyclops, are remarkable precisely because they stand out against a background of careful record-keeping. The triangle swallowed the Navy's mysteries and left the explanations alone. The use of sonar technology in post-war ocean surveying revealed, over several decades, an enormous field of wrecks scattered across the Atlantic and Caribbean seafloor. Many of these wrecks corresponded to vessels whose losses had long been attributed to the Bermuda Triangle or cited as evidence of its dangers. When the wreckage was located, it often bore clear evidence of the cause of sinking: hurricane damage, collision damage, structural failure, fire. The wrecks were in places consistent with their last known positions and the prevailing currents at the time of their loss. The seafloor of the Western Atlantic is, in the most literal sense, an archive. Its record is incomplete, but it does not lie. What it shows, overwhelmingly, is the ordinary violence of the sea. The Bermuda Triangle has been formally investigated by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the United States Coast Guard, and Lloyd's of London, among others. The conclusions of each investigation have been consistent. The triangle shows no statistically significant elevation in the rate of maritime or aviation losses compared to other heavily trafficked ocean regions. NOAA notes on its official website that the Bermuda Triangle is not recognized as a special area of concern by any United States government body, and that it does not appear on any official nautical chart. The legend has survived not because official investigation has confirmed it, but because official investigation has not been able to eliminate the individual stories, the individual losses, the individual human tragedies that accumulated in those waters over centuries of navigation. Among the less discussed dimensions of the Bermuda Triangle story is the role of insurance fraud in some of the vessel disappearances attributed to it. Maritime insurance fraud, deliberately sinking or abandoning a vessel to collect insurance money, has been a documented phenomenon since the earliest days of maritime insurance in the 17th century. Several investigators who have examined Bermuda Triangle cases have noted that certain disappeared vessels were either overinsured, in financial difficulty, or carrying questionable cargo manifests. The possibility that some vessels credited to the Triangle's mysterious forces were actually deliberately sunk does not make them less lost. It makes the mythology of the Triangle, in those cases, inadvertently useful to someone. The Puerto Rican island of Vieques, which forms part of the eastern anchor of the Bermuda Triangle, was used by the United States Navy as a live-fire training range from 1941 until 2003. During those 6 decades, the waters around Vieques accumulated an extensive debris field of spent ordnance, training targets, and military wreckage. Some of this material is genuinely hazardous. The seafloor around Vieques holds more unexploded ordnance than almost any comparable area of American coastal waters. This is not a mystery. It is the documented result of 60 years of naval training operations. It is worth noting that the military's use of these waters and the subsequent environmental contamination received far less popular attention than the legend of missing ships. The geography of the Florida Straits, the narrow channel between Florida and Cuba that forms the western corridor of the Bermuda Triangle, creates navigational hazards that have been documented since the earliest days of Spanish colonial navigation. The straits are approximately 150 kilometers wide at their narrowest point and carry the full volume of the Gulf Stream northward. Vessels attempting to use prevailing winds and currents to pass through the straits have always had limited room for navigational error. The reefs of the Florida Keys run along the northern edge of the straits for several hundred kilometers. Numerous historically documented wrecks along this reef system represent not mystery but the predictable consequence of attempting to thread a narrow maritime corridor in adverse conditions. One of the more obscure details of the Flight 19 story is that one of the Avenger pilots, a young man named George Stivers, had attempted to transfer out of the training flight earlier in the week. His request had been denied on administrative grounds. He was 21 years old. Another of the pilots, Forrest Gerber, had made a similar request. Both men flew on the afternoon of December 5. Their individual experiences of the final hours of that flight, the growing disorientation, the fruitless radio calls, the darkening sky and failing fuel gauges, are not recorded anywhere. The sea has their final hours. What the record preserves is the paper trail before the flight, the radio transcripts during it, and the silence after. The Bermuda Triangle mythology expanded significantly in the late 1960s and 1970s alongside a broader cultural interest in the paranormal. Works like Erich von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods created a reading public receptive to the idea that conventional explanations were inadequate to describe human experience.
The Bermuda Triangle fit neatly into this intellectual environment.
If ancient monuments might be the work of alien architects, then missing aircraft might be evidence of alien collection. The two ideas shared a grammar: the world is stranger than science admits, and the strangeness is evidence of something beyond ordinary understanding. This grammar was commercially powerful.
It sold books, filled theaters, and made the Triangle, for a decade, one of the most discussed geographical features on Earth.
The Triangle region includes some of the most heavily monitored ocean in the world. The United States Coast Guard maintains multiple stations along the Florida coast, the Bahamas, and Puerto Rico.
Military radar installations cover much of the airspace over the western Atlantic.
Maritime traffic monitoring systems track vessel movements throughout the region. And yet the loss of a small aircraft or a small vessel in these waters can still occur in ways that leave no trace, no signal, and no evidence retrievable within a reasonable time. A private aircraft flying below radar coverage in marginal weather can simply cease to exist from a tracking perspective. The gap between the extensive safety infrastructure of the modern Atlantic and the ongoing ability of the ocean to swallow small craft without record is, in itself, a kind of tribute to the scale of what the sea actually is.
The Bermuda Triangle contains several submarine communication cables that have been laid and relayed across its seafloor since the 19th century.
The first transatlantic telegraph cable was laid in 1858.
Subsequent cable routes brought telecommunications infrastructure through Caribbean and Western Atlantic waters.
These cables required regular maintenance, and their maintenance logs provide some of the most detailed surveys of the Atlantic seafloor available for the 19th and early 20th centuries. The cable maintenance records note, with straightforward regularity, the hazards of the region: strong currents, rocky seafloor, areas of unusual depth and unusual shallowness. They describe a technically challenging and often dangerous work environment. They do not describe anything that could not be explained. The extraordinary commercial success of the Bermuda Triangle literature in the 1970s generated a feedback loop. As more books were published, more cases were needed to fill them, and so the definition of what constituted a Bermuda Triangle disappearance broadened. Events that had occurred long before the Triangle mythology existed, and that had been satisfactorily explained in the historical record, were retroactively recruited into the narrative.
Events that occurred outside the Triangle's geographical boundaries were absorbed by extending those boundaries. Events that had conventional explanations had those explanations omitted.
The mythology was not merely built on genuine mysteries. It was actively maintained by selecting, distorting, and omitting the evidence that surrounded each case. This is not a unique mechanism in the history of popular mythology. It is, in fact, the standard one. The story of the Bermuda Triangle, at its core, is a story about human loss and how cultures process it. Every ship that vanished in those waters carried people whose families never received closure. Every aircraft that disappeared left behind colleagues, friends, parents, and children who had no grave to visit, no wreckage to examine, no clear answer to what had happened. The Bermuda Triangle, as a cultural construct, as a named and bounded place with a mythology attached to it, offered those families and those communities something that investigation could not always provide: an explanation.
Not a comforting one, exactly.
But an explanation that acknowledged the strangeness of the loss, that placed it in a category beyond ordinary comprehension, that said, this was not an ordinary accident.
Something extraordinary happened here. Even if that something was the sea itself. The island of Bermuda sits at approximately 32 degrees north latitude, roughly the same latitude as South Carolina or Morocco.
This places it at the northern edge of the subtropical gyre, a region of relatively calm, high-pressure-dominated weather. And yet Bermuda is struck by hurricanes with notable frequency, because it sits at the point where Atlantic hurricanes most often make their northward turn. The island's history includes numerous devastating storm strikes. The same atmospheric dynamics that make Bermuda's latitude seem temperate also make its position on the hurricane highway exceptionally exposed. The island endures. Most structures in Bermuda are built with this endurance in mind: thick limestone walls, sloped white roofs designed to funnel rainwater, buildings that have outlasted centuries of Atlantic storms.
The USS Scorpion, a United States Navy nuclear submarine, sank in the Atlantic in May 1968.
Her wreck was eventually located by a Navy search operation more than 3 months later, resting on the seafloor at a depth of approximately 3,000 meters, roughly 740 kilometers southwest of the Azores. She is frequently included in Bermuda Triangle literature.
The location of her wreck, southwest of the Azores, is well outside any reasonable interpretation of the triangle's boundaries.
Nevertheless, she carried 99 crew members. She sank suddenly and without surviving distress communications, and her cause of sinking remains officially undetermined, though a propulsion system failure or a malfunctioning torpedo are considered most probable. The Scorpion is a genuine maritime tragedy.
The triangle had nothing to do with it.
The deepwater survey technology that emerged in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, autonomous underwater vehicles, side-scan sonar arrays, high-resolution bathymetric mapping, has begun to place the wrecks of the Bermuda Triangle on the record in a new way. When a wreck is found and examined, when its hull can be photographed and its damage pattern analyzed, it stops being a mystery and becomes evidence. The ongoing mapping of the Atlantic seafloor has located wrecks whose positions confirm the historical record, whose damage patterns match the storms and failures documented in the archives, and whose existence removes them from the category of without trace.
The ocean is slowly giving up its record. Not all of it,
but enough to understand the shape of what happened in those waters over those centuries. The tongue of the ocean, a deep water channel that cuts between Andros Island and the Exuma Islands in the Bahamas, has been used as a submarine testing ground by the United States Navy since the 1960s. The channel descends to depths of more than 2,000 meters within a few kilometers of the surrounding shallow Bahama Bank, making it ideal for acoustic testing in submarine operations that require deep water in proximity to mainland facilities. The presence of active military submarine operations in the tongue of the ocean has resulted in a number of restricted zones and no-fly areas that have occasionally generated navigational confusion for civilian pilots and mariners unfamiliar with the area.
The tongue of the ocean is not a portal to another dimension.
It is a Navy testing range.
That it occupies the heart of the Bermuda Triangle is one of the region's more prosaic ironies.
The aviation term lost communications, describing an aircraft that has ceased to make radio contact with air traffic control, is, in most cases, a mundane technical event. Radio failures in aviation are common.
Aircraft continue to their destinations. Controllers work around the silence with established protocols.
But lost communications that occurs over open ocean, far from any radar coverage, in degraded weather, at night, in an aircraft already experiencing difficulties, that is a different matter.
The sequence of failures that preceded many Bermuda Triangle disappearances was not a single catastrophic event but a cascade: a compass problem, a radio problem, a navigational misidentification, a weather deterioration. Each problem, in isolation, was manageable.
Together, they were sometimes not.
The Caribbean Passage has been used for human navigation for at least 5,000 years before the first European vessels crossed the Atlantic.
The indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, the Taino, the Siboney, the Arawak, navigated between islands using double-hulled canoes, reading the stars, the currents, the wind patterns, and the behavior of birds above the water. These navigators understood the waters of what is now the Bermuda Triangle intimately. Their methods were sophisticated and their accumulated knowledge was extensive. The arrival of European navigation in the late 15th century introduced a maritime culture that was, in many respects, less attuned to the specific hazards of these waters than the indigenous maritime traditions it encountered and ultimately displaced. Some of what Europeans experienced as mysterious in the Western Atlantic was simply unfamiliar. The Bermuda Triangle encompasses the northern extent of the Caribbean hurricane track at a time in the calendar year when marine traffic through the region is at or near its peak. Recreational boating in the Florida Straits and the Bahamian archipelago reaches its highest density during summer months. Small aircraft traffic between Florida and the Caribbean islands peaks during the same period. The seasonal overlap between maximum marine and aviation traffic and maximum hurricane risk has been consistent across every decade for which records exist. Many of the disappearances cited in triangle literature occurred during the hurricane season, in weather conditions that post-event meteorological reconstruction has identified as severe or deteriorating. The pattern is seasonal. The triangle mythology is not. The use of accurate navigational charts of the Western Atlantic and Caribbean lagged behind the opening of these routes to regular maritime traffic by decades. The earliest Spanish charts of the Caribbean, produced in the 16th century, contained significant errors that persisted through multiple revisions. The positions of islands, reefs, and shoals were inaccurate enough to mislead navigators who trusted them, and accurate enough to mislead navigators into trusting them. Successive generations of European maritime powers produced improved charts of these waters, but the process of accurate cartographic surveying continued into the 19th century. Vessels navigating the Bermuda Triangle region with inadequate charts were not the victims of mystery. They were the victims of the gap between where their charts told them they were and where the ocean actually placed them. The USS Cyclops had two sister ships, the USS Proteus and the USS Nereus, both of which also disappeared in the Atlantic during World War II. The Proteus and Nereus were both lost in late 1941, sailing between the Caribbean and the east coast of North America. They were almost certainly sunk by German submarines, which were conducting intensive operations in the Western Atlantic at that period. The loss of all three colliers of the same class in the same general region of ocean, within roughly 2 decades of each other, has been cited as evidence of the triangle's malevolent consistency. It is, rather, evidence of the specific vulnerabilities of that ship class combined with the very real hazards, human and meteorological, of the wartime Western Atlantic. The atmospheric phenomenon known as a microburst, a sudden, intense downdraft of air that can reach the surface at speeds exceeding 60 meters per second, is now understood to be a significant hazard to low-flying aircraft in tropical maritime environments. Microbursts are associated with thunderstorm activity and can develop within minutes, creating a column of descending air that spreads outward on contact with the surface. For a small aircraft flying at low altitude in developing weather, a microburst provides no time to respond. The aircraft is pushed into the water before any distress signal can be transmitted. The phenomenon was not well understood until the 1970s and 1980s, following a series of devastating commercial aviation accidents. It is consistent with several of the faster and less explained aviation disappearances in the Triangle record. The fishing industry has operated in the waters of the Bermuda Triangle for centuries, and the fishing communities of Florida, the Bahamas, Bermuda, Puerto Rico, and the Caribbean have accumulated generations of practical knowledge about the region's hazards. Commercial fishermen work in conditions and at scales of distance that recreational mariners rarely approach. Their knowledge of local weather patterns, current behavior, reef locations, and seasonal hazards is intimate, granular, and often unwritten. When asked about the Bermuda Triangle, fishermen who work those waters typically respond with the pragmatism of professionals. The sea is dangerous. It has always been dangerous. It is particularly dangerous in certain places, in certain seasons, in certain weather. This is not news. The human response to disappearance, as opposed to death, involves a particular kind of grief. When a person dies, there is a body, a location, a moment. When a person disappears at sea, there is none of these things. The sea has taken them, but the sea gives no report. The families of the men of Flight 19, of the crew of the USS Cyclops, of the passengers on the Star Tiger and Star Ariel, they had no funerals in the traditional sense.
No grave to tend. No fixed location for their sorrow.
The Bermuda Triangle offered those families in that public and named location for grief a place that could be pointed to on a map, a place that bore the weight of the loss.
The triangle, in this sense, was not a geographical phenomenon. It was a memorial with no center.
The historical record of Spanish salvage operations in the Western Atlantic reveals a counter-narrative to the Bermuda Triangle's reputation for swallowing things without trace. The Spanish crown, across 3 centuries of colonial treasure shipments, mounted extensive and often successful salvage operations to recover gold and silver from wrecked galleons.
Spanish salvors worked in the waters of the Bahamas, Florida Keys, and the Caribbean with wooden diving bells, free divers, and grappling equipment.
They recovered significant quantities of treasure from vessels that had sunk in those waters. The fact that the ocean gave up some of its contents to determined human effort in the same waters now considered supernaturally dangerous suggests that the Atlantic's capacity to retain secrets is real but finite, and subject to technology and persistence. The development of modern aviation safety systems, transponders, emergency locator transmitters, GPS, APIRB devices that activate automatically upon contact with water has dramatically reduced the number of aviation losses in the Bermuda Triangle region. The same is true for maritime safety systems, APIRBs, satellite communication, AIS vessel tracking, modern weather forecasting. The frequency of mysterious disappearances in the triangle has declined substantially in the last 4 decades, not because the triangle has become less dangerous but because the tools available to pilots and mariners have become vastly more capable of identifying where craft are and what is happening to them. The triangle is quieter now than it was in 1948 or 1968. The ocean has not changed. The technology has. The peculiar geometry of the Bermuda Triangle, its 3 points connected by straight lines that traverse some of the world's most complex maritime environments, has encouraged a way of thinking about loss that treats geography as cause. If losses cluster within a boundary, the boundary becomes meaningful. But the boundaries of the triangle, as drawn by Gaddis in 1964, were not drawn around a cluster. They were drawn around a route, the most heavily traveled maritime and aviation corridor in the Western Atlantic. Any heavily traveled route will produce losses, because any heavily traveled route exposes a large number of craft to whatever hazards that route contains. The triangle's shape describes traffic, not danger. One of the most interesting geological features of the Bermuda Triangle region is the presence of underwater caves and blue holes throughout the Bahamian archipelago. The Bahamas contain hundreds of such formations, vertical shafts in the limestone seafloor that descend to depths of 60, 100, or more than 200 meters. These blue holes were formed during ice ages when sea levels were lower and the Bahama Bank was dry land, and they preserve extraordinary records of past climates, ancient cave systems, and in some cases, the remains of animals who fell into them when they were above water. They are not the mouths of vortices. They are archives of deep time, left in the floor of a shallow sea, accessible to divers who know where to find them and how still to hold themselves in the current. The role of alcohol in maritime and aviation disasters has been consistently documented by safety investigators across multiple decades. The combination of alcohol with the disorienting conditions of nighttime overwater navigation, in which spatial orientation is already difficult and visual cues are minimal, is particularly dangerous. Several of the disappearances associated with the Bermuda Triangle involve private vessels or light aircraft departing from Florida or Caribbean ports in the late afternoon or evening. Investigative bodies that have examined these cases have noted that the toxicological history of crew members was, in many cases, either unknown or untested. The Triangle's list of mysteries includes, in all probability, a number of accidents whose human contributing factors were never examined. The concept of electronic fog, a theoretical phenomenon in which some unknown electromagnetic field disrupts navigation instruments, communications equipment, and even the perception of time entered the Bermuda Triangle literature through the account of pilot Bruce Jernon, who claimed to have passed through a cloud tunnel over the Bahamas in 1970 and emerged 100 miles ahead of his calculated position in far less time than his instruments should have recorded. Jernon described his experience vividly and consistently across many retellings. His account is impossible to verify independently. The electronic fog concept was developed by Jernon and co-author Rob McGregor in a 2005 book and has since been cited as a possible unified explanation for the triangle's disappearances. Scientists have not confirmed the existence of any electromagnetic phenomenon consistent with Jernon's description. His account remains precisely what it is, one pilot's experience of something he found genuinely inexplicable. The Bermuda Triangle's most famous fictional cinematic appearance occurred indirectly through Steven Spielberg's 1977 film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which featured Flight 19's aircraft appearing in the Sonoran Desert of Mexico as a result of alien intervention. The choice placed Flight 19, and by extension, the Bermuda Triangle, permanently in the cultural vocabulary of extraterrestrial contact, in a way that no amount of Coast Guard press releases could subsequently dislodge. Fiction, once it has named a feeling, is very difficult to unfeel. The image of those aircraft, intact and impossibly present in a desert landscape, encoded something about the triangle into visual culture that statistical arguments could not easily reach. The deeper historical context of the Bermuda Triangle includes the Atlantic slave trade, which for 3.5 centuries routed ships through these waters carrying an estimated 12.5 million enslaved Africans to the Americas. The mortality rate of the Middle Passage was devastating. Ships were lost to storms, to navigational error, to disease and fire and structural failure. The Atlantic seafloor along the major slave trade routes holds the wreckage of dozens of vessels whose losses are documented in the historical record. None of these vessels has ever appeared in the Bermuda Triangle mythology. The Triangle's canon of mysteries is a selective construction, shaped by the editorial priorities of the mid-20th century writers who built it. The ocean holds far more than they chose to see. The night sky over the Bermuda Triangle is, on clear nights far from urban light pollution, extraordinary in its clarity. The western Atlantic offers some of the darkest maritime skies accessible from the east coast of North America, and the stars visible from the surface of the ocean in those conditions include the full sweep of the Milky Way and the navigational stars that sailors have used since antiquity. Before electronic navigation, these skies were essential. After electronic navigation, they became largely irrelevant to the practical work of getting from one place to another. But the stars over the Atlantic at 3 a.m, seen from the deck of a vessel 100 miles from the nearest land, still carry the weight of all the navigation that preceded the instruments, all the dead reckoning, all the celestial sighting, all the careful attention to the sky that the ocean demanded for centuries from the people who crossed it. The question of whether the Bermuda Triangle is real or myth has occasionally obscured a more fundamental observation, that the western Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the waters around Bermuda constitute one of the most historically consequential maritime regions on Earth. The trade routes that ran through this water connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas for 5 centuries. The wars fought along and across these waters reshaped empires. The hurricanes that swept through this region altered the trajectories of civilizations. The people who died in these waters, in storms and shipwrecks and battles and terrible crossings, numbered in the millions across those centuries. The Bermuda Triangle is, in the most literal sense, a region soaked in human history. The mythology it generated is a small and recent addition. The history itself is vast enough to require no embellishment. The American government's official position on the Bermuda Triangle has been consistent since the late 1970s. It does not exist as a formally recognized geographic or hazard designation, and the incidents associated with it have conventional explanations. This position has been stated by the Coast Guard, by NOAA, by the Navy, and by numerous government investigators. It has not, however, eliminated the triangle from public consciousness. Official denials of a myth rarely do. The myth serves purposes that official position statements cannot address, purposes related to the need for mystery, the comfort of extraordinary explanation, and the human resistance to the idea that the world is, ultimately, entirely explicable. The triangle persists not because the government is wrong but because the human need for wonder is stronger than any institution's capacity to satisfy it with fact. Among the most persistent elements of the Bermuda Triangle mythology is the claim that compasses within the triangle behave erratically or point in directions inconsistent with magnetic north. This claim rests partly on misattributed Columbus references, partly on isolated pilot reports, and partly on the genuine phenomenon of magnetic declination variation. Modern magnetometric surveys of the western Atlantic have found no anomalous magnetic field concentrations within the triangle's boundaries. The region's magnetic environment is consistent with what Earth's magnetic field models predict for that latitude and longitude. Aircraft and vessels equipped with modern navigation receivers pass through the triangle without experiencing compass anomalies. The compass myth survives not because of evidence but because it is one of the myth's most evocative elements. A compass that refuses to point north is a powerful image of a world that has ceased to follow its own rules. The cultural history of the Bermuda Triangle includes a significant chapter in the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, the triangle mythology was treated by Soviet media with considerable interest, not because Soviet journalists accepted its supernatural dimensions, but because the frequency of American military aircraft and naval vessels disappearing in a defined region of ocean offered a useful rhetorical frame. Soviet commentators occasionally suggested that the disappearances might be the result of secret American weapons testing, experimental technology, or classified military operations that the United States government was not acknowledging. This interpretation was, in its own way, a mirror image of the American mythology. Both versions agreed that the explanations being offered were inadequate. They disagreed about what the real explanation was. The fishing communities, maritime pilots, and deep-sea divers who have worked the waters of the Bermuda Triangle for generations carry a relationship with those waters that bears almost no resemblance to the mythology that has grown up around them. For a Bahamian boat captain who has navigated the channels of the Exumas since childhood, the specific texture of the water in certain weather, its color, its behavior at the surface, the way the light hits it at different times of day, is a navigational tool, inherited from generations of predecessors who read the same signs. The triangle is not an abstraction to these people. It is a specific place, with specific hazards and specific beauties, that requires specific knowledge and sustained attention to navigate safely. This knowledge is the opposite of mystery. It is intimacy. The last great mystery of the Bermuda Triangle may be the one it has always contained, not the mystery of what happened to the missing ships, but the mystery of why their loss required a supernatural explanation at all. The sea has been taking ships since the first vessel was launched. The ocean does not distinguish between the famous and the forgotten, the well-equipped and the careless, the wartime crossing and the peacetime pleasure cruise. It applies the same physics to each. What the Bermuda Triangle did, in the mid-20th century, was give that ancient and universal reality a name, a shape, and a mythology, and in doing so, it made it possible for millions of people to feel the strangeness of the sea without having to stand on its surface and look down. That is not nothing. The sea is strange. The loss is real. And the story, even stripped of every supernatural element, even reduced to its statistical and meteorological components, still carries within it the weight of all the people who went out across that water and did not come back. Somewhere in the western Atlantic, the water is dark tonight. The Gulf Stream moves through it, warm and purposeful, carrying what the ocean has chosen to keep in motion. Below, at depths snow light reaches, the seafloor holds its record in silence, the pressed timber of hulls, the corroded instruments, the accumulated material of every crossing that ended there rather than in harbor. The Bermuda Triangle does not exist as a defined place with defined properties. This we know. The investigations have been thorough. The statistics are clear. The ocean floor, where it has been examined, tells a story consistent with weather, navigation, mechanical failure, and the immense volume of traffic that has passed through those waters for 5 centuries.
And yet, the sea has always been the oldest frontier of human anxiety.
Long before there were maps, there were stories about what lay beyond the edge of the known water, what consumed ships that sailed too far, what lived in the deepest places, what happened to the people who did not return.
The Bermuda Triangle is a modern version of a very ancient story.
It gives a name and a shape to the fear that the world contains zones of genuine unknowing, places where the rules that govern ordinary life do not apply, where explanation runs out, where the ocean keeps its counsel. That fear is not irrational. The world does contain such zones.
They are not defined by latitude and longitude. They are defined by the limits of what any human life can know and understand and control.
The sea, at sufficient distance from shore, in sufficient depth, in sufficient darkness, becomes one of them.
It always has been. What the Bermuda Triangle offered the 20th century was a geography for a feeling that predated geography. A name for the terror of open water. A map of the unmappable.
The men of Flight 19 flew into it and did not return.
The crew of the USS Cyclops sailed into it and did not return.
Hundreds of others, named and unnamed, crossed those waters in vessels of wood and steel and aluminum and did not return.
Their losses are documented, or they are not.
Their causes are known, or they are not. The ocean does not close its cases. It simply continues warm and dark and moving, carrying what it has been given to carry, keeping what it has chosen to keep.
Somewhere in the western Atlantic, the stars are out tonight. The water is very deep.
And the surface is perfectly calm.
Sleep well.